Moving to a quiet neighborhood was supposed to be a fresh start for Maya, a break from the chaos of the city. But soon after she settled in, she noticed something strange. Her reclusive neighbor, Mrs. Harrington, had a secret, one hidden behind a rusty shack that no one in the neighborhood seemed to talk about. Every day at exactly 9 a.m. and 9 p.m., Mrs. Harrington would disappear into the shack with bags in hand. Maya couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly off. What was Mrs. Harrington hiding? And why was she so desperate to keep people away? What Maya discovered would change everything. But hey, before we dive into the story, do yourself a favor and pause the video right now. Go hit that like button, and let's see if we can make this video reach 1,000 likes. And if you haven't done so already, please subscribe to your favorite story channel. Also, make sure to ring the notification bell so you never miss out on the latest and weirdest stories. Trust us, you won't want to miss what's coming your way. Now sit back, relax, and prepare to be amazed as we take you on an unforgettable ride. Don't forget to engage with us in the comments below. We love hearing from you. Without further ado, let's dive right in. Maya Thompson had always been a city girl. After spending more than 3 decades surrounded by the hustle and bustle, she finally made the decision to seek a quieter, more peaceful life. The noise, the crowds, and the constant rush had become exhausting, and she longed for serenity and the freedom to focus on her passion for writing. So, when the opportunity came to move to a small, charming neighborhood on the outskirts of the city, she jumped at the chance. The neighborhood was everything Maya had dreamed of. Quiet, with friendly neighbors, and the kind of place where time seemed to slow down. Her new home was a modest house with a quaint garden and a perfect view of the peaceful streets. It felt like the perfect place to finally find the peace she had been craving. But Maya's dream of tranquility was soon disrupted by something unexpected. Her attention was quickly drawn to her neighbor across the street, Mrs. Harrington, an older woman in her 60s who lived in a dilapidated house that looked like it hadn't been maintained in years. The paint was peeling, the windows were crooked, and the lawn was a jungle of overgrown weeds. Despite her best efforts to settle into her new life, Maya couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Mrs. Harrington was distant, rarely engaging with anyone in the neighborhood. Maya had introduced herself when she first moved in, but the older woman had barely acknowledged her. It was as if she wanted nothing to do with anyone. But it wasn't Mrs. Harrington's cold demeanor that intrigued Maya the most. It was the small, run-down shack that stood about 20 feet from her house. The shack, barely bigger than a garden shed, looked like it could fall apart at any moment. It had a rusty tin roof, sagging walls, and an old padlock on the door. At first, Maya thought it was just a storage shed, but she soon realized that something strange was going on. Every morning and evening at precisely 9 a.m. and 9 p.m., Mrs. Harrington would leave her house and head straight for the shack. She always carried 2 large shopping bags, and she would disappear inside the shack for about 20 minutes before returning to her house. It became a ritual, one that Maya couldn't help but notice as she sat by her window, trying to focus on her writing. The more Maya watched, the more curious she became. What could Mrs. Harrington possibly be doing in that shack twice a day? Every day? The question gnawed at her, distracting her from the story she was trying to write. She tried to dismiss it, telling herself it was none of her business, but the mystery only grew stronger. Unable to resist any longer, Maya decided to take a closer look. One afternoon, after watching Mrs. Harrington make her routine visit to the shack, Maya casually strolled over, pretending to be out for a walk. She didn't get far before Mrs. Harrington came rushing out of the shack, her eyes wild with fury. "Stay away from here!" Mrs. Harrington screamed, her voice filled with panic. "I'll call the police if you come any closer!" Maya froze, taken aback by the intensity of the older woman's reaction. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to intrude," she stammered. "Mind your own business," Mrs. Harrington shouted, before storming back into the shack and slamming the door behind her. Shaken, Maya returned to her house, but her curiosity only grew. Why was Mrs. Harrington so desperate to keep people away from the shack? What was she hiding in there? Maya couldn't let it go. She had to know. That night, after the neighborhood had gone quiet, Maya made her move. She waited until Mrs. Harrington had made her evening visit to the shack and returned to her house. Once the lights were off, and the old woman was presumably asleep, Maya slipped out of her front door and made her way across the street. When she reached the shack, she noticed the padlock on the door, but something else caught her eye. A small gap in the wooden boards that made up the wall. It was just big enough to peek through. With her heart racing, Maya leaned forward and peered inside. At first, the interior was too dark to make out, but as her eyes adjusted, she gasped. Inside the shack were dogs, at least a dozen of them, all of different breeds, shapes, and sizes. Some were curled up in corners, others were pacing restlessly, and all of them looked thin and weary. The sight shocked Maya to her core. "What's going on here?" she whispered to herself. "Why are all these dogs locked up in here?" Without thinking, Maya grabbed the door and tried to force it open. "Hang on, I'll get you out of here," she muttered under her breath, determined to free the animals. But the door wouldn't budge, and she soon found herself banging on it in frustration. Suddenly, a light flicked on inside Mrs. Harrington's house, and within seconds, the front door swung open. Mrs. Harrington came rushing out, her face twisted with anger and fear. "What are you doing? Get away from there!" she yelled. Maya spun around, her own frustration boiling over. "What am I doing? What are you doing keeping all these dogs locked up in here? This is cruel." Mrs. Harrington stopped in her tracks, her expression softening from anger to desperation. "No, please," she said, her voice trembling. "You don't understand." "I understand enough," Maya shot back. "I'm calling the police." "Please don't," Mrs. Harrington begged, her voice breaking. "Just listen. I'm not hurting them. I'm saving them." Maya frowned. "Saving them? What do you mean?" Mrs. Harrington sighed and lowered her gaze. "These dogs, they're strays. I've been finding them all over town, abandoned, mistreated, starving. I bring them here because I can't bear to see them suffer. I feed them. I take care of them. I know this isn't ideal, but I'm doing what I can." Maya's anger began to fade as she listened to the older woman's explanation. "But why keep them locked up in here?" she asked softly. "There are too many of them," Mrs. Harrington admitted. "And I'm allergic to some of the breeds. If I brought them into the house, I'd be in the hospital. But out here, I can at least make sure they have food and shelter." Maya was silent for a moment, processing the information. She had been so quick to judge, but now she realized that Mrs. Harrington was just trying to do the right thing in the only way she knew how. "I want to help," Maya said finally. "We can't keep them all here, but maybe I can take a few to my house. And I know a vet, my brother-in-law." who might be able to help find homes for the rest. Mrs. Harrington's eyes filled with relief. "You'd do that?" "Yes," Maya said with a determined nod. "We'll find them good homes." Over the next few days, with the help of Maya's brother-in-law, the malnourished dogs were taken to a local shelter where they could receive proper care. Maya ended up adopting 2 of the puppies herself, and Mrs. Harrington was grateful to finally have the help she needed. In the end, what had started as a mystery turned into a story of compassion and kindness. Maya had found the peace she was looking for, not just in her new home, but in the unexpected friendship she formed with Mrs. Harrington and the dogs they had saved together.